Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Chicago, my hometown. Steve, how dare you come to Chicago and make fun of the Chicago Cubs? I was a little insulted by that, but otherwise I agreed with everything you said. It actually reminded me of a famous story. What a great Chicagoan. Do you all remember the great journalist, Robert Bob Novak? Novak was a good friend of mine and a real mentor, and I'll never forget this. The Cubs were in the playoffs, about to go to the World Series. John, I'm sure you'll probably remember this as a lifelong Chicagoan. And it was Game 7, and the Cubs had their ace on the mound, and they had a big lead. And of course, what did the Cubs do but blow the game in the 7th and 8th and 9th innings? And it was an incredibly depressing day for anyone from Chicago. And so to make matters worse, that was the night that Ronald Reagan debated Walter Mondale. I don't know how many of you remember that first debate that Reagan had against Mondale, but let's just say it was the only bad debate Ronald Reagan ever had in his entire life. And so I ran into Bob Novak the next morning. I said, Bob, aren't you totally depressed about the way things went yesterday? And Bob turned to me and he said, Steve, yesterday was the most depressing day of my life. The Cubs lost the World Series and Walter Mondale is going to be the next president of the United States. Well, fortunately, he was wrong about that second prediction. How many of you watch Fox News pretty regularly here? A lot of you do. I had such a wonderful morning. I came in, flew in, that one of the first people I saw at the airport runs up to me enthusiastically, beautiful lady. She throws her arms around me. She's so excited. And she says, I know you, don't I? And I said, well, ma'am, I'm not really sure. She said, I'm sure I've seen you on TV. And so I thought I'd kid her a little bit. So I said, well, I'm not sure, ma'am. I said, what do you watch? And she scratched her head. She looked up at me again. She said, wait a minute. She said, didn't I see you on Wheel of Fortune last week? And I said, yes, ma'am, that was me. But anyway, it's fun. My day job is working for the Wall Street Journal, as John mentioned, and my night job is working at Fox. You all know the theme of Fox News, fair, balanced, and blonde. Met a lot of beautiful women at Fox News. And by the way, let me ask you all this. How many of you read, and be honest, how many of you in this room read the Wall Street Journal editorial page? Most of you do. Thank you for helping pay my salary. It is a great newspaper, and we're doing very well. And by the way, maybe the best piece of advice that I can give you, and I give a lot of talks on college campuses, and the one piece of advice I always give these kids, and maybe the most important advice, is this: that if you want to be the smartest person in the room, when you're drinking your Starbucks coffee in the morning, just take 10 or 15 minutes and read those 3 editorials every morning. This is a very selfish thing to say, but I believe we've got some of the best writers and thinkers in the country, and our motto at the Wall Street Journal editorial page for the last 75 years has been free minds, free markets, and free people. And we have really stuck to that theme throughout the last 3/4 of this century. I have some really good news, by the way. If you look at the 5 major newspapers in the country today, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the USA Today, only one of those newspapers is making money. Anybody want to guess what paper that is? The Wall Street Journal. But even better news than that, by the way, have any of you looked recently at the finances of the New York Times? That newspaper is about this close to being in federal bankruptcy court, and it just couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. All right. So Jonathan Williams and the others at ALEC asked me to talk a little bit about what's going on with this U.S. economy and kind of give you all an Economics 100 course in about 25 minutes. And I'm happy to do that. You all in this room understand this stuff better than anyone. Probably it's your colleagues that need to get this lesson more than you do. But let me start by saying this. There is, I think, on our side, too much negativity, too much of a dour and dire view about where this country is headed. And I will say this as a free market conservative, that I'm actually quite optimistic about the direction of our economy, notwithstanding what we've been through for the last 4 years and all of the litany of policy mistakes. I'm very optimistic about our ability as a nation to grow and to see the kind of hyper growth that we saw in the Reagan years that this country deserves and that we just haven't seen in the last 5 years under President Obama. And one of the reasons I'm extremely optimistic about where the economy is headed, and John, you touched on this a little bit yourself, is the big revolution that is going on in energy in this country. And I believe, as an economist, ladies and gentlemen, this is the biggest story in America in terms of the economy, the revolutions and renaissance that's going on in this great country. How many of you in this room, by the way, have ever been to the great state of North Dakota? Raise your hand. Anybody, how many of you here are from North Dakota? The North Dakota, well, what a great state you've got, by the way. I made the mistake. I went to North Dakota for the first time in my life back last January. By the way, I love your state of North Dakota, but I learned if you go to North Dakota, do not go in January. It is damn cold in North Dakota. But what an incredible place. And you probably can gather why I went there, because North Dakota is the epicenter of the energy boom that is going on in this country, that is revolutionizing this country's economy. And it's just an amazing thing to see. You mentioned, John, the fracking revolution. By the way, just as a short aside, ladies and gentlemen, to be against fracking is like being against a cure for cancer. This is one of the great technological breakthroughs of our time. But the other great technological breakthrough is something called horizontal drilling. And by the way, both of these technologies are made in the USA, inventions, and it's amazing the human ingenuity that allows us now to drill 4 or 5 miles deep into the ground, and then through horizontal drilling 2 or 3 miles in any direction. It's an incredible thing. And to make a very long story short, what they're doing now with the fracking and horizontal drilling is that in a state like North Dakota, where you have the Bakken shale, they are able to crack through this shale rock and the oil and gas has been stored there for millions of years, but we have never previously had the capacity to get at this oil and gas, and now we can do it. I love this story. The state in the United States that has the lowest unemployment rate is the great state of North Dakota. And North Dakota officially the unemployment rate is 3% in North Dakota, but I am here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, North Dakota does not have a 3% unemployment rate. It has a negative unemployment rate. That is to say, there are more jobs than there are workers to fill those jobs in North Dakota. So as you probably know, I now live in Washington, D.C., the belly of the beast, but I also travel to New York once a week. So I travel back and forth to Washington, New York, that corridor. And so whenever I'm walking on the street of Washington or New York and I see a panhandler, and you can do this in your own cities, if you see that panhandler, tell them to go to North Dakota, because that's where the jobs are in America. So in any case, you probably don't want them to come, right? But in any case, let me cut to the chase here. North Dakota, ladies and gentlemen, because of these energy technological breakthroughs, has more oil and gas than Saudi Arabia has, which is an amazing, amazing thing to think about. And it's not just happening in North Dakota, it's happening, how many from Pennsylvania? Pennsylvanians here, a few of you. How many from West Virginia? A few West Virginians. These states have also, had huge gains in the amount of energy that they have. One of my favorite stories, by the way, about the energy revolution that's going on in oil and natural gas is that because of horizontal drilling, you can go in any direction by miles. And how many of you in this room are a legislator or live in a state that has banned hydraulic fracturing? A few of you had. California has, New York has, a few other states. I don't know if they've done this, John, in Illinois yet. I know there's been some talk about doing it. But my favorite part of the story is, Pennsylvania, which is also a state that's getting very rich off fracking, they have now, because New York State has banned fracking, what they're doing in Pennsylvania, is this great American ingenuity or what? They're drilling wells down in Pennsylvania, they're going horizontally under New York, and they're taking all their oil and gas. So I love that part of the story. But why am I telling you all this? Why am I spending some time on this? Because, ladies and gentlemen, if we get our energy policies right at the state level and especially at the federal level, it is very possible that within 10 years, the United States of America, this great, great country of ours, can move from being an oil and gas import country to being an oil and gas export country. Now think about the implications that has, not just for our economy, but also for our national security. The fact that we wouldn't have to import $300 billion worth of this stuff from countries like Iran, from countries like Saudi Arabia, from countries like Venezuela, that let's face it, do not have America's best interest at stake. So that is an important part of the story. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on from a policy point of view, and I'm going to kind of run you through very quickly, if I may, a kind of quick PowerPoint presentation on kind of my view of the economy. I call this prosperity and capitalism because everyone in this room, you wouldn't be here if you didn't understand that capitalism is what creates prosperity. And I want to start with this. Let's see, how do I... Can you move forward? There you go. Oops. Okay. All right, let me start with this. This is just showing you the U.S. economy over the last 50 years. And this is the stock market. Anyone who's involved in financial markets has seen this many times before. The blue line is simply the U.S. stock market, the S&P 500 over the last 60 years. And the green line is simply the S&P 500, but what I've done is inflation adjusted the returns, because obviously when you make an investment, you're interested in your after inflation, not your before inflation rate of return. What is the point of this chart? Well, first of all, you can see what happened in the terrible 1970s under what I call the three stooges of the American presidency, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. You see the huge decline. The 1970s was the worst decade for U.S. economic growth and incomes and jobs since the Great Depression. And then you can see what happened starting in the early 1980s. The way I like to put this is that the clouds dispersed, the sun came out, and God gave America Ronald Reagan. And you can see, if you don't think that policy and policymakers can make a difference, ladies and gentlemen, look at what happened over the next 20 years. The biggest economic boom in the history of the planet. The amount of wealth creation in the United States, our net wealth as a country went from $18 trillion to $60 trillion over the next 20 years. Again, no country in the history of civilization has ever seen anything like what happened in America in the 1980s and 1990s. And by the way, under a Republican president, President Reagan and Bush, and even an acceleration of growth under a Democratic president, a conservative one in Bill Clinton. And then you can see at the end of this what we call the lost decade. The last decade has had almost no growth. You see the two bubbles that burst. The first bubble obviously being the high technology bubble that burst in 1999 and 2000, and then of course the terrible real estate depression and the subprime crisis that happened. And so the question we have to ask ourselves as Americans is, how do we get back on this prosperous path that we had in the 1980s and 1990s and get out of the rut that we've been in now for the last 10 years? And I would submit to you, and maybe this is one of the most important charts in this presentation. If you look at this chart, what this is showing you is the green line there is the highest income tax rate in the United States. And by the way, this is a national lesson, but it's also a lesson for states. And so you can see what happened in the United States in the 1970s. Believe it or not, we had a highest income tax rate of 70%, which of course means, to put this very simply, that when you have a 70% tax rate, for every additional dollar that you earn, either as an investor or a worker, the government takes 70 cents of that dollar, and the individual keeps 30 cents. And if you're in a high-tax state like Illinois or a high-tax state like California or New York, it wasn't 70 cents of the dollar, it was more like 80 cents on the dollar. And the point that the great Jack Kemp and the great Ronald Reagan and the great Art Laffer, who you're going to hear from on Friday, and the Wall Street Journal editorial page, we were all making the case at that time that those tax rates were so high and confiscatory that they were smothering growth, they were smothering entrepreneurship and investment. And Reagan came in, and you can see one of the most amazing things that Reagan did was he successfully cut tax rates very dramatically 2 times. You can see the top tax rate went down from 70 to 50%, and then a few years after that, we passed a tax reform act that brought the highest tax rate all the way down to 28%. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a very, very, very big deal. To have the highest rate go from 70% to 28% meant that the after-tax rate of return on investing and working went from 30 cents on the dollar to 72 cents on the dollar, if you can follow the math there. And so that's a big, big incentive for growth. It's no surprise that the economy boomed when those tax rates came down. But here's the part I love about this chart. You see that yellow line, what that is measuring is the share of taxes paid by the richest 1% in America. The evil richest 1%, the people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Lady Gaga and people like that. And you can see what happens here. I mean, this is such an amazing thing. The yellow line actually goes up. The share of taxes paid by the rich went up as the tax rate went down. In fact, the share of taxes paid by the richest 1% went from about 19% when we had a 70% tax rate all the way up to about 40%. Recently, it's fallen a bit recently because of the terrible recession and the non-recovery that we've had under Barack Obama. But that is an amazing, amazing thing to behold. And as wonderful as it is to be telling you all this, I cannot tell you how much I wish sitting in those 4 empty seats right there were Larry Summers and Tim Geithner and Joe Biden and Barack Obama. Because I just think when it comes to these tax issues, they don't have their tray tables in the upright and locked positions, right? They just don't understand this stuff. And I'm sure it's true of many of your colleagues as well. If you tax something, you get less of it. If you tax something less, you get more of it. And this is an important story because one of the great things that's going on in America is that over the last 2 years, there have been over 20 states that have cut their tax rates. And if you're from one of those states, bravo and congratulations. And John, I just wish we had done it here in the state of Illinois. Illinois is actually one of the states that has moved in the wrong direction on this. And Kirk, I hope when you become governor, you can do something to reverse that. But I want to show you this. I know that ALEC, one of the things that makes ALEC such a great organization is that it is nonpartisan. So I wanted to quote one of my favorite Democrats of the last 50 years, the great John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was a tax cutter. A lot of liberals don't understand that about JFK, but he was. In fact, before he was assassinated, he was promoting a very large 30% income tax rate reduction. And I just want to read you this quote, if I may, because it is one of my favorite quotes from American history. John has heard me quote this so many times, but it is such a great lesson, and it is so simple but profound. And President Kennedy said at the New York Economics Club, "It is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high and tax revenues are too low," and this is the part I love, "the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now." Wow. How many people in Washington believe that today? Not very many, and that's the kind of re-education that needs to be going on. In fact, one of the guys who doesn't believe that is President Obama. You can see what's happened with tax rates. One of the reasons the economy is underperforming, as you know, for the last 9 months, this U.S. economy is growing at 1%, which is just an abysmal rate of growth. We should be growing 4 to 5 times faster than that. And I would submit to you one of the reasons this economy keeps stalling out is we did exactly the wrong thing on taxes. Instead of cutting tax rates, you can see what happened to the death tax, the dividend tax, the capital gains tax, the income taxes. All of those went up, and there's no doubt in my mind that that is one of the things that, at least for now, has slammed the brakes on a recovery that should be much stronger. Now, you know, we're talking a lot about tax reform. This is the Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama simplified reform. How much money did you make? Send it in. You know, it can't get a lot more difficult to understand than that. But I want to show you one other thing on this tax fairness issue, because I know this is an issue not just at the federal level, but it's an issue also at the state level. People say, well, when you cut tax rates, it just benefits the rich. And one of the most amazing things is today in America, as you can see, the blue line is the share of taxes paid by the top 1%. The red line is the share of taxes paid by the bottom 95%. In 2007, for the first time in American history, the top 1 out of 100 Americans paid more in federal income tax than the bottom 95 out of 100 Americans. What that is telling us is 2 things. One is we have a steeply progressive tax system. In fact, the United States depends on rich people to pay the taxes more than virtually any other industrialized country. We have a progressive tax system. Do not let liberals say that we don't. And the second lesson here is if we want to balance the budget and we want more tax revenues to be collected, which we do, the way to do that is to create more rich people, right? We need more rich people if we're going to balance this budget, and there's nothing wrong with getting rich in this country. That's the American dream. Now, I'm going to skip forward, and I just want to show you one thing that might kind of knock your socks off. The other part of the equation is what's happening on the monetary side of the equation, and I'm not going to dwell on this too long because I know not monetary policy can be very, very boring. You know, one of the banes of my existence is I travel all over this great country of ours. I spend half my life on airplanes, and the bane of my existence is to get stuck in a middle seat on an airplane. I just won't do it, right? And so I found this trick. Actually, Steve Forbes taught me this, that if you're ever stuck on the middle seat of an airplane, what you do is you start talking about monetary policy, and it clears out the whole row, and you get the whole row to yourself. In any case, so I want to show you this really quickly, though. You've all heard of QE1, QE2, QE3. People are very confused about what this means. And to put it very simply, what it means is that we have seen over the last 5 years the biggest injection of money into the U.S. economy, dollar bills, trillions of dollars of them in the history of this country. So much so that, in fact, over the last 4 years, we've more than doubled the amount of supply of money into the economy. And you can see what happened in the great, what they're now calling the Great Recession in 2008, the huge spike up in money, the supply of money in just 3 months increased by double. And then you can see what happened to QE1, where the federal government bought about $1 trillion of those toxic mortgage securities. And then you can see what happened with QE2, which is essentially $1 trillion of 30-year treasury bills that have been bought up by the federal government. Now we're on, this doesn't even have QE3 on here, which we're in now, where the federal government is putting about $80 billion a month into the U.S. economy by buying up more mortgage-backed securities. And of course, the long-term implication of this is so obvious. It's obvious to anyone in this room. I think just about everybody outside of Washington understands this, that the long-term implications of all that pumping money into the U.S. economy is inflation. If you continue to print money, you know this from your Economics 100 class. Remember this one? What is inflation? Inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. We've dug ourselves, in my opinion, into a hole with this massive amount of money creation. We don't have a lot of inflation out there now, but I'm worried about this if we don't start pulling back quickly. You can see, by the way, here's the pattern on Treasury bill. We've seen 30 years of declining interest rates. Over the last few months, we're starting to see those interest rates rise. I'm very worried about what happens if we continue to print money. Will we see those rates rise higher and higher? And by the way, just something to think about. Every 100 basis point increase in interest rates, and we've seen a 100 basis point increase in interest rates just over the last 6 months. Every time interest rates go up by 100 basis points, the federal deficit over the next 10 years goes up by another $1 trillion, because who's the biggest borrower in the whole world? It's the United States of America. So it's something we need to worry about. You can see I'm not going to go into this, but real interest rates actually hit negative for a while earlier this year, and that's because people were so worried about the direction of the economy. I want to make one or two other quick points. I'm running out of time, but I think this is really critical point to you all as state legislators. I want to hammer this point home, if I may. What I'm showing you here is what has happened to the change in prices over various industries over the last decade. And you can see, you may not be able to read the columns at the bottom, but the blue pillars, the ones that are negative, those are things like cars and trucks, apparel, clothing, computer software, and computers. Those over the last 10 years have actually been falling in price, partly because of import competition, partly because those industries have become hyper efficient and competitive. And one of the great things about this free market system of ours is that when you have competition, it drives down prices. And you can see that in spades with what's happening with those industries. What this means, by the way, is if you go in and buy a new Ford truck today, the Ford truck costs less today than it did 5 years ago. That's very pro-consumer. Now, here's what I want you to pay attention to. Look at these red pillars and look at the industries, ladies and gentlemen, where we have seen the biggest increase in prices. Now, let's set aside energy, because energy is a commodity, and actually because of the energy boom, those prices, I think, are going to start falling, not rising. But look at the other two industries in America where prices are out of control: education and healthcare. Education and medical care. Now, here is the question I would pose to you all as lawmakers and people involved in policy. What do those two industries have in common? Or let me ask it a different way. Who runs those two industries? The government does, right? I mean, this is an amazing thing. The two industries in America that are most controlled by government are the two industries where prices are out of control. John, you mentioned Obamacare. One of the highest priorities of this country, at least in Washington, and for you all at the state level, is to make sure that this god-awful law does not take effect. Because the truth is, not only are we going to see a huge diminution in the level and quality of care that we have in the United States, but it is not going to bend the cost curve downward, it is going to bend the cost curve up. Every time we've increased the federal presence in healthcare, the costs go up. And the same is true about education. And may I say, just as an aside, as a private citizen and a parent of 2 kids that you mentioned, I have I have 3 sons. I have 2 teenagers who I don't like very much, and then I have a 12-year-old. But my 2 teenage sons, they're in college. So you mentioned one of them is at Illinois and one of them is at Northwestern. And Kirk, I got to ask you this question. Do you want to take a wild guess at what I am paying in tuition at Northwestern, all-in, room, board, and tuition? Anybody want to take a guess? $62,500 a year. My son at Illinois, which is a state school, now we pay out-of-state tuition, I'm paying $35,000 a year. The point I am making, by the way, I sat down with my son before he went off to Northwestern. I said, son, you can go to Northwestern for 4 years, or I'll write you a check right now for $200,000 and we'll both be better off. He said, maybe I'll take the check. Let me cut to the chase here. The biggest scam in America is the cost of college tuition today. Something has got to be done to do this. John, when you talked about what is happening, I loved your story about, the woman at the gas pump. We all see that every day. Every time those prices go up, it puts a crimp on family incomes, and what is happening in America today is a middle-class squeeze, and you did a great job of explaining that. But one of the biggest squeezes on the middle class today is the high price of college tuition. It is high time that you all as state legislators demand some accountability from those universities that you're dumping so much money in. Please do that, because it is an unsustainable trend that's going on there. And let me just show you finally, just think about what would happen if we saw the kind of productivity improvements in government services like universities that we've seen in the private sector. And this is just explaining, what has happened with inventions over the last 100 years. And one of the incredibly positive things about this economy is that it's a cliche, but it is so true. It is what is driving us, is that we are now living in a digital age, a digital revolution that is changing our lives right before our very eyes. So all I'm doing here is measuring, how long does it take from inventions, from the time they're invented to the time the average person can afford them. The telephone, it took 71 years. So from the time Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone to the time the average middle-class family had a telephone, that took 71 years. It took 50 years for electricity. You can see it took 30 years for radio. Now look at these modern things. Look at the things like cell phones. Look at things like iPods. Look at iPads. Look at the internet. Within 10 years or 5 years from the time these things are invented now, they're instantly affordable to the mass public. The perfect example of this, by the way, is the iPhone. The iPhone came on the market 5 years ago, cost about $400. Now you can get an iPhone 5 for less than $200. If I'm back 2 years from now, they'll cost less than $50. That is a reduction in price that makes these things affordable. It is a great, great story, and the tragedy is that we're not seeing that rate of productivity in public services. And I love to show this, by the way, just to give you a sense of how things have changed. Anybody know what movie this is from? Wall Street. That's Michael Douglas playing the part of Gordon Gekko. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, look at that thing he's holding in his hand. That looks like a brick with an antenna coming out of it, right? And here is the amazing thing. If you want to see how technology is changing our economy, think about this. That movie was made in 1987, so almost exactly 25 years ago. The cost of that machine, that brick that he's holding in his hand, $4,200. Now they damn near give the things away for free. And that's the kind of productivity revolution that we should demand and insist on in government. And I'll finally conclude with just one last point. I am extremely optimistic about this country. I'm extremely optimistic about what's going to happen politically in this country. I think it's a great thing that we have a black president, and that we have a president who has such a great family, and it's just such a wonderful thing that anybody can become president in this country. But I disagree pretty profoundly with the policies of this president. And here is the amazing thing. In Washington, D.C. right now, Barack Obama, for the most part, is a lame duck. He cannot get anything accomplished. We've got a lot of gridlock in Washington, and gridlock is not such a bad thing. But we do have failing institutions. And if you look at those failing institutions in America, the failing institutions are all institutions of government. Our tax system, our healthcare system, our tort system, You go down the line. All of these things that aren't working in the country that are dysfunctional are run by government. And the challenge for you all as legislators, and not just, I tell this to members of Congress. I gave a talk to the Senate Republicans a few weeks ago. I made this same message, but it's so true for you all as state legislators too, that the challenge is every decision that you make, if you would simply keep in mind every time you vote on a piece of legislation, whatever it has to do with, ask yourself this question. Will this piece of legislation that I'm about to vote on, will this make America a more competitive country or a less competitive country? Will this make America, because look, I believe as an economist, the greatest issue confronting our country over the next 5, 10, 25 years is this. Will the United States of America continue to be the global economic superpower that we have been for the last 75 years? For all of our lives, the United States has been the unrivaled superpower, right? No country, we've led the world in job creation and innovation and technology. We've been the military superpower over the last 75 years. No country's ever gotten as rich as the United States has. But now, for the first time, we do have a rival, right? We have an honest-to-goodness rival now in China. And this is the great issue of our time. Will it be the United States that continues to be the hub of the world economy, or will that center of gravity move from the United States to China? Well, I sure hope that it stays in the United States, because I believe, as everyone in this room does, that the United States has been a force for good, not evil. But that's the question. And, the Chinese are catching up with us. There's no question about it. If you look at their rate of growth in China, they've been growing at about a 10, 11% rate of growth for the last 20 years, which means their living standards have been doubling about every 8 to 10 years. It's been an incredible miracle. If you want to see the power of the free market system, look at what's happened in China. Now, they're not a free market economy, but they've moved dramatically in that direction over the last 25 years. And I will simply say this. When we had the Chinese economic minister in our office a few months ago, and he was telling us all about the great things that are happening in China, and again, it's a miracle. And he ended his talk by saying that within 8 years, by 2019, he said China will surpass the United States. And I couldn't take this much longer, so I stood up and I said, sir, that's not going to happen. I assure you it's not going to happen, because the reason I know that will not happen is because our Chinese are so much smarter than your Chinese, which is true, actually. But here is the point. Let's get serious about competitiveness. Let's make sure the United States of America, this great, great country, and every one of your states remains focused on growth, on liberty, and making America the greatest country we can. Thank you very much. Have a great conference. It's a pleasure to be with you.